York, this is Democracy Now!
Oklahoma's at a very low number. They've done really fantastic work. They have a pretty new, magnificent arena, as you probably have heard, and we're getting exact numbers out, but we're either close to or over 1 million people wanting to go.
President Donald Trump says he'll push ahead with a massive indoor campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma this Saturday, even as COVID cases are surging there. 99 years ago this month, Tulsa was the site of the deadliest massacre of African Americans in U.S. history, when a white mob killed as many as 300 people.
I will always remember 4 men coming in our house with torches, and my mother saw them coming, and she put the 4 of we children under the bed. And from under the bed, we could see them walking to the curtains and setting fire to the curtains to set our house on fire.
We'll go to Tulsa to speak with Hannibal Johnson, author of Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. Then to the second most economically unequal district in New York State, the Bronx, where an insurgent campaign for Congress is threatening to unseat 16-term Congress member, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel.
This is the worst crisis since the Great Depression, and people don't know where their congressman is? He's taken us for granted. After 31 years of the same, it's time for a change.
We'll speak with former middle school principal Jamal Bowman, who has just been endorsed by Senator Elizabeth Warren, is also backed by Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the New York Times. And we'll look at moves to privatize Puerto Rico's electric grid as hurricane season begins again. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In the United States, 740 people have died of coronavirus over the past 24 hours, bringing the death toll to nearly 117,000. More Americans have now died from the virus than were killed in World War I. The Washington Post is reporting 9 states reported single-day highs of COVID cases Tuesday on new 7-day average highs. The states are Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Nevada, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, South Carolina, and Texas. President Trump is scheduled to hold a campaign rally indoors in Tulsa on Saturday. Despite warnings from public health officials, the director of the Tulsa Health Department said he wishes Trump would postpone the indoor event. The Oklahoma Health Commissioner has urged all attendees to get tested for COVID and to wear face masks. 2 Oklahoma lawyers have sued an attempt to halt the rally, saying the event will endanger the entire Tulsa community. Trump's visit comes as the administration continues to downplay the severity of the pandemic. They will not require face masks at the rally, but they are requiring liability waivers people have to sign in case they get COVID-19 so they don't sue the Trump campaign. The White House Coronavirus Task Force has not held a briefing since April 27th. Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal says the number of COVID deaths in nursing homes and long-term care facilities has now topped 50,000 in the United States. This comes as the number of COVID-19 cases in prisons is skyrocketing. According to the New York Times, 68,000 prisoners have now been infected. The number's doubled over the past month. In Arizona, the ACLU and other groups have sued the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office seeking the release of vulnerable people from county jails. In recent weeks, the number of confirmed COVID cases in the county jail system has jumped from just 6 to over 300, a 5,000% increase. Meanwhile, COVID outbreaks at meatpacking plants continue to grow. At least 89 meatpackers have died. In April, President Trump ordered meatpacking plants to stay open despite the health risks, while the meatpacking industry has warned of possible shortages of meats exports of meat has reached a new high. A new report reveals the United States exported nearly 129,000 tons of pork to China in April. That's the highest monthly amount ever. On the international front, scientists in Britain say new tests have shown a widely used steroid called dexamethasone can greatly reduce death rates among the most severely ill COVID-19 patients. The World Health Organization described the findings as great news. In China, Beijing has closed its schools again and canceled thousands of flights after a new COVID outbreak. 106 Beijing residents have tested positive over the past week. In India, the death toll has reached nearly 12,000 after authorities registered more than 2,000 deaths on Tuesday. Meanwhile, Pakistan reported 140 people died over the past day, a new daily high. In Latin America, Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez has announced he has tested positive for coronavirus along with his wife and 2 aides. Hernandez says he began to feel unwell over the weekend. In Australia, authorities have announced Australia's borders will likely remain closed until 2021. Meanwhile, the United States has announced its borders with Mexico and Canada will remain closed to non-essential travel for at least another month. In other coronavirus news, a new study in the journal Health Affairs estimates as many as 450,000 cases of COVID-19 could have been prevented if states had mandated the wearing of face masks. President Donald Trump has signed an executive order on policing following more than 3 weeks of nationwide protests over the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The order calls for the creation of a national police misconduct database and to give federal grants to departments to improve training. Trump resisted growing calls to back an outright ban on the use of police chokeholds. Instead, the order calls on officers to only use them if they feel that their lives are endangered. During an address at the White House surrounded by police officials, Trump made no mention of systemic racism and sought to downplay the crisis.
Nobody is more opposed to the small number of bad police officers, and you have them. They're very tiny. I use the word tiny. It's a very small percentage, but you have them.
Civil rights leaders and legal advocates widely criticized Trump's executive order. The Reverend Al Sharpton called it toothless and meaningless. Kristen Clark of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law described it as anemic.
This order was incredibly anemic in that it does not deal with racial profiling. It does not impose a ban on chokeholds and neck holds. It does not end qualified immunity for officers. It does not strengthen the tools that we need to hold officers accountable and to make it possible to prosecute officers who use deadly or excessive force without basis.
Protests against police brutality and racism are continuing across the country. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, dozens of protesters have entered their 5th day, camped outside Bridgeport's police department. Members of the group Justice for Jason are calling on the police chief to fire police officer James Boulay, who shot dead 15-year-old Jason Negron 3 years ago. Jason's sister, Jasmine Melendez, is helping to organize the occupation.
We are in a state of emergency. We are no longer going to wait around for these people in power to listen to us. We are going to occupy this space until our demands are met, and we will not be leaving.
In Richmond, Virginia, the mayor has ousted the city's police chief after Richmond officers fired tear gas and rubber bullets at protesters Sunday and Monday night. Richmond officers had also tear gassed protesters earlier this month as they peacefully gathered at a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. According to the New York Times, at least 97 law enforcement agencies have used some form of tear gas against civilians protesting in recent weeks. And in Buffalo, New York, 75-year-old peace activist Martin Gugino is continuing to recover after being shoved by 2 police officers on June 4th. Gugino has suffered brain injury, a fractured skull, and is still unable to walk. 2 police officers have been charged with assault. In active duty, Air Force sergeant with ties to the far-right Boogaloo movement has been arrested for killing 2 law enforcement officials in California in recent weeks. Staff Sergeant Stephen Carrillo is accused of shooting dead a federal security officer in Oakland during the protests over the police killings of George Floyd in May. Later, Carrillo killed a deputy sergeant in the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office. Carrillo's lawyer says the Air Force sergeant had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. FBI Special Agent Jack Bennett spoke Tuesday.
To be clear, Carrillo elected to travel to Oakland to conduct this murder and take advantage of a time when this nation was mourning the killing of George Floyd. There is no evidence that these men had any intention to join the demonstration in Oakland, as some in the media have asked. They came to Oakland to kill cops.
Authorities have also arrested an accomplice of Sergeant Carrillo's. Earlier this month, federal prosecutors in Las Vegas charged 3 other men connected to the far-right Boogaloo movement with inciting violence during the recent protests and conspiracy to commit terrorism. The 3 men also had experience in the U.S. military. In Portland, Oregon, police have opened an investigation into the death of an African-American trans woman named Tete Gully, who was found hanging in a tree in late May. The local medical examiner ruled her death to be a suicide, but her family believes she may have been killed. Her death comes as federal authorities probe 2 recent hanging deaths of black men in California. Meanwhile, in New York, a protest is scheduled for Saturday to demand a full investigation into the death of Dominique Alexander, a 27-year-old black man who was found hanged in a Manhattan park last week. The local medical examiner's office ruled the cause of his death was suicide. The Equal Justice Initiative has issued a new report documenting nearly 2,000 confirmed lynchings of black people by white mobs in the United States between 1865 to 1877. The group, which was founded by Brian Stevenson, has spent years documenting the legacy of racial terror in the United States. It has previously documented 4,400 lynchings of black people in the U.S. between 1877 and 1950. In international news, at least 20 Indian troops have died in a border clash with Chinese soldiers in the Himalayas. It was the first deadly encounter by the 2 nuclear-armed neighbors in 45 years. China accused the Indian troops of crossing the disputed border, but India rejected the claim. Tensions are escalating on the Korean peninsula 1 day after North Korea blew up a joint liaison office near the South Korean border. The office was set up after the 2018 peace talks. North Korea has also threatened to send troops back to the border. Meanwhile, South Korean unification minister has offered his resignation as ties between North and South Korea worsen. Sweeping new U.S. sanctions on Syria go into effect today, despite warnings from aid groups that the sanctions could disproportionately impact Syrian civilians. University of Oklahoma professor Joshua Landis said, quote, "Sanctions are sure to hurt many innocent people. Syrians are already on their knees. This will simply bring them a bit lower," he said. The California utility company PG&E has confessed to killing 84 people as it pleads guilty to involuntary manslaughter charges over its role in starting devastating fires in Northern California in 2018. The fires destroyed 18,000 structures. Butte County District Attorney Mike Ramsey described the plea deal as unprecedented.
We're in our North County court today. Saw something of an unprecedented nature. A major United States corporation pleading guilty to 85 felony counts, 84 of which were homicide counts. In other words, killing 84 Butte County citizens.
In immigration news, prisoners held at the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego have reportedly been blocked from communicating with members of the group Otay Mesa Detention Resistance. The activist group has been instrumental in documenting the conditions at the privately run immigrant jail and offered support during recent hunger strikes. The jail has one of the largest coronavirus outbreaks of any immigration jail in the country. To watch our interview with a member of the Otay Mesa Detention Resistance, go to democracynow.org. In Mexico, about a dozen families whose loved ones have been disappeared have been camping outside the home of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador for almost 2 weeks, demanding his government search for the over 60,000 people who've gone missing in Mexico and bring their families justice. The families say the nationwide coronavirus lockdown has disrupted search missions and that proposed austerity measures announced in April will likely end vital funding and support to families of the disappeared. The Trump administration has sued former National Security Advisor John Bolton in a bid to block the publication of his forthcoming book. The Justice Department claims the book could compromise national security and that it did not go through the necessary pre-publication review process. President Trump recently publicly warned Bolton about publishing the book.
I will consider every conversation with me as president highly classified. So that would mean that if he wrote a book and if the book gets out, he's broken the law.
Meanwhile, the Daily Beast is reporting the White House is also looking into ways to block the publication of a forthcoming book by Trump's niece, Mary Trump. Her book is titled Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman here in New York with Juan Gonzalez, who's broadcasting from his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where President Donald Trump will host a massive indoor campaign rally Saturday, despite concerns that the gathering will lead to a surge in COVID-19 cases in a state where the virus is already alarmingly on the rise. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported Oklahoma has seen a 7.7% increase in COVID cases, the largest in the country. Tulsa's health director said he wished the president would postpone the rally, the first since the outbreak of the coronavirus in the U.S. in March, due to concerns about the virus. The mayor has also said he doesn't want it there now. 2 Oklahoma lawyers have sued in an attempt to halt the rally, saying the event will endanger the Tulsa community. Despite public health experts' warnings against large indoor gatherings, the Trump administration is moving forward with plans to fill the 19,000-seat arena for the rally, with tens of thousands more in the nearby convention center. Vice President Mike Pence, who will attend the rally, falsely claimed that, in a very real sense, Oklahoma had flattened the curve of COVID infections. This is Trump speaking Monday.
Oklahoma's at a very low number. They've done really fantastic work. They have a pretty new, magnificent arena, as you probably have heard, and we're getting exact numbers out, but we're either close to or over 1 million people wanting to go. We have a 22,000-seat arena, but I think we're going to also take the convention hall next door, and that's going to hold 40,000, so we'll have 22,000 plus 40,000, which would mean that we'll have over 900,000 people that won't be able to go, but hopefully they'll be watching.
The Trump campaign is requiring attendees to his rally to sign a waiver absolving the campaign of liability if an attendee contracts COVID-19, but they are not requiring the attendees to wear masks in contravention of the CDC. This comes as President Trump also faces outrage for choosing Tulsa, Oklahoma as the location of his first rally amidst a nationwide uprising against racism and police brutality. The Trump administration rescheduled the rally to Saturday after originally announcing it would be held this Friday. That's June 19th, or Juneteenth, a celebration of African Americans' liberation from slavery. But Tulsa is also the site of one of the deadliest massacres in U.S. history. In 1921, 99 years ago this month, a white mob attacked a black neighborhood in Tulsa, killing as many as 300 African Americans. Over 2 days, white mobs set fire to homes, businesses, and churches in Greenwood, a thriving African American business district known at the time as Black Wall Street. When the smoke cleared, the area lay in ruins. This is an excerpt from a History Channel documentary, The Night Tulsa Burned, which features some of the survivors who were just children when the attack occurred. This is George Monroe, followed by Juanita Burnett-Arnold and Ernestine Alpha Gibbs.
I will always remember 4 men coming in our house with torches, and my mother saw them coming, and she put the 4 of we children under the bed. And from under the bed, we could see them walking to the curtains and setting fire to the curtains to set our house on fire.
We start hearing shots, and my grandfather told us all to get up. And we got up, and we could see smoke and hear shots, and we couldn't sleep or anything. We were just frightened nearly to death.
But as soon as daylight came, we looked outside. All of these people were coming down this railroad track. Didn't nobody try to take a thing, and those people were coming along and tried to. They just had clothes on, that's all. Didn't try to take anything.
For more, we go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we're joined by Hannibal Johnson, attorney and author of several books about the history of Tulsa's African-American community, including Black Wall Street, from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood District, Up from the Ashes and Images of America, Tulsa's historic Greenwood District. So if you could start, Hannibal Johnson, by talking about what happened 99 years ago this month.
What happened in Tulsa in 1921 was really emblematic of the racial violence that pervaded the United States during that period. In fact, historians and sociologists refer to the early part of the 20th century as the nadir of race relations in America, the low point of race relations in America, because of the proliferation of these so-called race riots, mostly invasions of black communities by vigilante white mobs, and because of the prevalence of lynching being a form of domestic terrorism targeting primarily African Americans. So this was a period fraught with racial violence and historical racial trauma. The event in Tulsa is the worst of the so-called race riots during this period in terms of its magnitude. The business community in the Greenwood District, the black sector in Tulsa, was highly developed. A great concentration of service providers like doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, and dentists, but all manner of business enterprises, small businesses like movie theaters, dance halls, barber shops, restaurants, grocery stores, haberdasheries, shine shops, a real concentration of black entrepreneurship and black wealth in a 35 square block area in Tulsa, Oklahoma, separated from downtown Tulsa by the Frisco tracks.
Mr. Hannibal Johnson, you mentioned the racial conflicts of that period, which many Americans are not aware of, but there were throughout the country in the World War I, post-World War I period, there were these huge conflicts. There was the Houston Mutiny of 1917 of black soldiers against racism that they were perceiving in the military. There was the East St. Louis riot of 1917, the Chicago riot of 1919, and the Elaine, Arkansas massacre, where over 100 African Americans were massacred in Elaine. Was part of this the result of the fact that as African Americans, we began being impressed into the military? There was even more a willingness on the one hand of African Americans to stand up for their rights, and also of whites to seek to suppress the African American community.
Right. I think it's important to understand the pervasiveness and the power of white supremacy as a philosophy during this period. So we had these African American men who went off to war in foreign countries, sacrificed their lives potentially for the country and for their American citizenship. They come back to the United States and they're treated as, at best, second-class citizens, at worst, subhuman. So black men were much more vocal about protecting their civil rights. after having served in World War I. On the flip side of that, the white community, noticing this new sense of emboldenment on the part of African Americans, was determined to enforce white supremacy. And these events that were called race riots and these lynchings are really in service of white supremacy.
It's very interesting because we've been looking at the bringing down of the Confederate statues around the country and the naming of military bases after Confederates like Fort Bragg. And this was right around the same time, not during the Civil War, but way after, that they named these bases after Confederate soldiers, again, as they saw the rising empowerment of African Americans to pull them down. I wanted to go to Tulsa native Professor Olivia Hooker, a survivor of the Greenwood Massacre, describing the attack on her community that took place when she was just 6 years old. She was 92 when she did this interview.
I refuse to call it a riot because it was really, whites decided to burn down the homes of 10,000 people. So that was not a riot. It was a planned desecration. And when the mobs came in, they had those pine, knots all lighted up, and they set things on fire. And my mother refused to run because she was busy putting water on the house to try to keep it from burning. And so she put the children under the big oak table. They had those great big tables in those days with little nooks under them. So we were under the table when the mobs came in.
So that's Tulsa native Professor Olivia Hooker talking about what happened in 1921. And I wanted to ask you, Hannibal Johnson, about President Trump choosing Tulsa. Now, of course, there's the surge, and we know that COVID-19 hits the African-American community much harder than the rest of the community in this country. There's a surge in Tulsa. Many of the leaders are asking for it not to be held there. And he was going to hold it Friday, Juneteenth, the celebration of the end of slavery, which has outraged so many that even President Trump was forced to put it off for a day. Kamala Harris, the senator from California, vying for the vice presidency under a President Joe Biden administration, if that were to happen, said this isn't just a wink to white supremacists. He's throwing them a welcome home party. Can you respond to this choice of location and the original date?
Right. So the rally is troubling to a lot of people because of both the venue, Tulsa, and because of the timing. So we're in the midst of a COVID pandemic. We're in the midst of a surge here in Tulsa, bringing thousands of people together in a tight space where it's not possible to socially distance, where people don't have to wear masks. Those people are going to attend the rally, then they're going to spill out into the community writ large and pose substantial risk to all of us here. So that in and of itself is a problem. The other problem with timing is that even though the rally has now been moved to June 20th as opposed to June 19th, it's still Juneteenth weekend. There still are festivities going on. It's a celebratory atmosphere of a very significant day in our history, particularly for African Americans. The rally comes 2.5 weeks after the 99th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So it's an issue of sensitivity at the very least. And the other dynamic that's important to think about is the character of the rally. And we know something about the potential character of the rally based on prior experience with these sorts of rallies, which tend to be raucous. They tend to be exclusive rather than inclusive. They tend to have elements of race and racism as part of the experience. So that troubles a lot of people because here in Tulsa, we are working hard on reconciliation, on moving our community closer together as we approach the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And the rally has the potential to be a disruptor, to to where we are on the road to reconciliation.
I wanted to ask you, of course, the country has been swept for weeks now by protests over police abuse and the murders of African Americans. But the Tulsa police major, Travis Yates, recently denied the existence of systemic racism in the police force. He said African Americans probably should be shot more. In a recording, you can hear him say, quote, all of the research says we're shooting African Americans about 24% less than we probably ought to be based on the crimes being committed. Your response to the police major in your city?
Well, he says that remark was taken out of context, but the remark speaks for itself. It is deeply troubling. It has been rebuked by both the police chief, Wendell Franklin, and the mayor, G.T. Bynum. And it is not reflective of the officers, ranking officers, whom I know and have worked with for many, many, many years. But again, it is deeply troubling. Whatever the context may have been, whatever the intention may have been, it's deeply problematic. To put those words together on a radio show in the midst of all the things that the country is going through and all the things that we've gone through here in Tulsa.
And, of course, you have the situation of the two kids. I don't even want to say jaywalking. 13-year-old Tulsa residents who were brutalized by the police. I mean, the video of these kids, one of them put in the car, and you see the police officer kicking him. They accuse him of jaywalking on a rural road. I mean, one of these kids is 13 years old that doesn't have sidewalks. Hannibal Johnson, have they been suspended? Have they been fired? Have they been charged with assault, meaning the police officers?
So all I know is that the matter is under investigation, as well it should be. On the surface of things, based on the facts that we know as you just recited them, this is deeply disturbing and troubling. So we need to find the facts, and we need to hold people accountable as appropriate based on the facts and circumstances that are determined through the investigatory process.
Well, Hannibal Johnson, I want to thank you very much for being with us, attorney and author of Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood District. Final question, 20 seconds. Are people getting reparations for what happened in 1921? Wasn't there a commission set up that said they should?
There was a commission that was convened in 1997, issued a final report in February of 2001. It recommended reparations for riot survivors and descendants of riot survivors who could prove loss of property. There was a lawsuit filed in the early 2000s. It was dismissed on the basis of statute of limitations. So cash reparations to individuals have not happened. We are looking at reparations in other forms, including building a substantial history center here in the Greenwood District, a pathway to hope that connects various sites in the Greenwood District, and other initiatives that are more community-based rather than individually focused.
Thank you so much, Hannibal Johnson. We will continue to look at Tulsa on Friday on Democracy Now!, when we'll be joined by the sister, the twin, of a man who was killed by police in 2016. Her great-grandmother survived the Tulsa Race Massacre. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Puerto Rico. Stay with us.
Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I just keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom line. Ain't gonna let nobody
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As hurricane season begins, we turn to Puerto Rico, which was devastated in 2017 when Hurricane Maria killed at least 3,000 people, destroyed much of the island's power grid, leaving many without electricity for months. A new investigation reveals the Puerto Rican government issued a $1.5 billion contract to a company for the first large power generation project since the storm without the proper oversight. The report accuses Puerto Rico's Electric Power Authority of giving an unfair advantage to New Fortress Energy when it contracted with the company to convert two major power stations from operating on diesel to natural gas. The report also accuses the island's power company of failing to consider the project's environment, safety, and health impacts and alternative sources of power like renewable energy. The report comes amidst ongoing moves to privatize Puerto Rico's electric grid. It was co-authored by Ingrid Villabiagi, who joins us now from San Juan, Puerto Rico. She is president of Cambio, a Puerto Rico-based environmental nonprofit, former chief of staff for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. She co-authored the new report with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Ingrid, welcome to Democracy Now! Just lay out what you found and the level of really vision corruption in this.
Yes, first of all, thank you for having me. And like you just mentioned, this is an ill-conceived project full of fiscally irresponsible practices, full of irregularities that start from the absence of a desirability and convenience study that did not even was put forth in order to determine whether this was a project that was beneficial to Puerto Rico. This is the conversion to natural gas of 2 units for the San Juan 5 and 6 generation facility for the Power Authority, PREPA, in Puerto Rico. This is a project that was started as an unsolicited proposal by New Fortress Energy, which it presented December 2017, scarcely 2 months after Hurricane Maria, when Puerto Ricans did not have power. We didn't even have adequate communication, and we already had this company presenting to the Power Authority this unsolicited proposal, which provided them with access and continued communication to the authority and a confidentiality agreement, which granted them information about these 2 units. Then the authority moves into an RFP process without providing information to bidders of this ongoing communication with this company or the confidentiality agreement that it had set forth, as well as other information that was vital in terms of the properties that it had strategically acquired. So we're calling for the cancellation of this project, which, as you mentioned, is a $1.5 billion project that would continue to lock in fossil fuels on the island and would prevent the aggressive integration of renewable energy, which would be the sustainable transformation that Puerto Rico deserves right now.
And Ingrid Villabiagi, how did New Fortress Energy get this sort of cozy relationship with the Puerto Rican, the Electric Power Authority? It's a company, as I understand it, that was formed by former executives of BlackRock, of Goldman Sachs, and of UBS. What's been its track record? Does it have a track record in this kind of liquid gas production for electricity anywhere else in the world?
It has. First of all, it doesn't have a track record in Puerto Rico, and it has a very limited time experience in terms of natural gas. That's one of the questions that we raised. How was this company selected versus other companies? And like I mentioned, this was presented as an unsolicited proposal to the authority. So the project as itself was conceived by the private sector, which has been one of the great problems that PREPA has faced in the past in terms of lacking planning and then allowing for then private interests to push in these projects that do not serve the best interests of the people of Puerto Rico. Our investigation is based on public documentation that we were able to obtain through litigation with PREPA. PREPA was not willing to provide us these documents, and we had to go to court to get them. So what we found through that public documentation is all these irregularities in the process prior to the RFP process and during the RFP process. We are able to identify, though, some law firms, for example, that were contracted by PREPA to negotiate this contract after it was awarded to New Fortress. And that same U.S. law firm represents entities for the parent company of New Fortress. We were not able to find a specific documentation regarding how who introduced them to Puerto Rico, and that's, I think, part of the investigation that should be conducted by federal and local authorities to find out and provide questions to the many issues that we raised in the report.
And Ingrid, I'd like to ask you also about a separate report that came out that Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, and also on the original transition team for President Trump, is now a lobbyist at $30,000 a month for the Puerto Rico Electric Company. What exactly is Chris Christie doing there, and what's his expertise?
Yes, there's no information in terms of what he's doing. PREPA announced last week, or it was disclosed, that this contract was set forth for the upcoming months, supposedly to help with federal funding and to get federal funding to actually arrive to Puerto Rico. However, this is another of those contracts that has no accountability and comes to add to over $270 million in contracts that have been awarded at PREPA for professional services and financial advisory in the past 2-3 years. We have to remember, $270 million perhaps doesn't sound like a big amount of money in the U.S., but this is a bankrupt corporation. $270 million in public services, public professional services, amounts to a whole lot of money that could be used for the maintenance of the infrastructure, for adopting renewables, for rooftop solar projects. So we definitely question this professional service contract as well as the other ones that have been awarded in the authority.
So finally, as you are in hurricane season, Ingrid, began on June 1st, and you have this sun-soaked island, to have poured this much money, let alone the reason that they have given it to this company. Jose Ortiz, the head of the power company, said that your report showed complete ignorance around the contract, that it was approved by the Federal Control Board that oversees Puerto Rico's finances. If you could respond and say what you're demanding right now.
Well, I mean, Jose Ortiz's reaction does not address any of the irregularities that we've raised in the report, and he tries to dismiss our report by questioning the professional experience of the authors, in this case, Tom Cincillo and myself. We're both former public officials with vast experience in contract supervision. And like I mentioned, he's just trying to distract the attention from the report. And in terms of your statement regarding the beginning of hurricane season, definitely. It creates quite a bit of anxiety to know that the forecast for this hurricane season is going to be quite an active one, and that Puerto Rico is not better poised to address an extreme weather event than it was when we faced Hurricane Maria, precisely because PREPA has not implemented and has not addressed renewable energy and other more sustainable alternatives to make the grid more resilient and reduce vulnerabilities for the population of Puerto Rico. Regarding approvals during the process, those are some of the things that we question in the report. I mean, the Fiscal Control Board approved this, yet acknowledging in their own write-up that the project was 30 to 40% above industry benchmark costs. So, I mean, we do want, that's why we're asking for an independent outside investigation of this whole process to see how a project with and a contractor with so many issues and a process with so many irregularities was able to conclude and a contract was able to be signed. And now we have this project that we have to deal with on the island.
Well, Ingrid Villaviaggi, we thank you so much for being with us. President of Cambio, speaking to us from San Juan, Puerto Rico. And before we go to break in the next 30 seconds, Juan, if you could talk about the Supreme Court decision that just came down around Puerto Rico's debt.
Yes, Amy. Well, a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled, but it was in the midst of all of the protests, the national protests around police abuse, so it didn't get much attention in the U.S. It basically ruled that the appointment of the Promesa board, which basically is running Puerto Rico's economy and is really supersedes the local government, that the appointment of those officials by Congress and the president was legal. There had been a series of lawsuits in the courts trying to challenge the legality under the appointments clause of the Constitution, that the members of the board were not appointed with the advice and consent of the Senate, as is required of federal officers. And the court ruled it was a strange opinion. It was a unanimous opinion, but there was a 7-vote majority opinion written by Justice Breyer. And then there were 2 other concurring opinions, but separate opinions, one by Justice Thomas and one by Justice Sotomayor. And Justice Sotomayor's opinion was actually a dissent, even though she agreed with the majority opinion. She went into perhaps her most detailed legal brief on the status of Puerto Rico. And the important thing, I think, that Justice Sotomayor said in this decision, in her opinion, was that that really she questioned the entire legitimacy of the Promesa board itself. And she said, and I want to quote this because people should read this opinion. It was a 24-page opinion. It says, these cases raise serious questions about when, if ever, the federal government may constitutionally exercise authority to establish territorial officers in a territory like Puerto Rico, where Congress seemingly ceded that authority long ago to Puerto Rico itself. And she went on to say that the Promesa board members tasked with determining the financial fate of a self-governing territory exist in a twilight zone of accountability, neither selected by Puerto Rico itself nor subject to the strictures of the Appointments Clause. And she goes on to say, I am skeptical that the Constitution countenances this freewheeling exercise of control over a population that the federal government has explicitly agreed to recognize as operating under a government of their own choosing. She basically says you are not taking into account the rest of the court, that back in the 1950s, the United States granted self-governance to Puerto Rico, and now by the imposition of the control board, that's taken that away. And so she basically says, I'm going along with this Appointments Clause decision, but the basic question here has not been settled. And I think it's the most she's had several opinions now, dissenting opinions to the court on the issue of Puerto Rico, Sanchez Valle, Franklin Templeton, and now this one, where she basically says you got to deal with the colonial relationship of Puerto Rico.
Well, and of course, we'll continue to look at that. But up next, we're going to look at an insurgent campaign to unseat 16-term Congress member and House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel. We're going to speak with his challenger, Jamal Bowman, who's just been endorsed by the New York Times, AOC, Senators Warren and Bernie Sanders. Stay with us. Song of Light by Taina Asili. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we turn to the second most economically unequal district in New York State. That's the Bronx, where an insurgent campaign for Congress is threatening to upset the Democratic establishment as protests against police and systemic racism continue to roil the country. Not far from where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took down longtime Congressmember Joe Crowley in 2018, former middle school principal Jamal Bowman is now running to unseat 16-term Congressmember, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel, and represent New York's 16th congressional district in the Bronx and Westchester County. Bowman is running on a Green New Deal, Medicare for All platform and has responded to the recent spate of protests across the country by saying he supports defunding the police. Congressman Engel, meanwhile, has called for police reform. The congressman's also faced criticism for his support of the 1994 crime bill, for spending much of his time in his home in Maryland rather than in his district. Earlier this month, Engel was caught on a News 12 mic asking Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. if he could speak at a rally after a night of protests against police violence. He then told Diaz that, quote, "If I didn't have a primary, I wouldn't care." Unquote. The race has gained national attention as New York's primary election approaches next Tuesday on June 23rd, with Democratic heavyweights Hillary Clinton, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, House Majority Whip James Clyburn throwing their support behind Engel. Meanwhile, Jamal Bowman is backed by Senators Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, New York Times, Justice Democrats, and the Working Families Party. Well, he is joining us now from Yonkers, New York, just finished up with a campaign event there. Jamal Bowman, thank you for joining us on Democracy Now! Can you talk about why you think your campaign can succeed? You've gotten a number of extremely important endorsements, and what you feel is the most important message out of these anti-police brutality protests around the country that are also focused very much right here in New York.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Good morning. I've worked in this district for the last 10 years as a middle school principal. I actually opened my own community public school right here in the Northeast Bronx. And over that 10 years, I've developed thousands of amazing relationships with the children and families of this community. And I've learned intimately the impact of poverty and bad policy on their lives each and every day. And what I also learned was that Congressman Eliot Engel has been incredibly absent and disengaged in most of the district. He does a good job of engaging about 9% of the district, while the rest of the district feels unheard and unsupported in terms of what they're going through. With regard to the protests happening across the country, I'm inspired by it. I'm excited by it. If you look throughout American history, it's been protests and mass movements and the people rising up that has moved this country forward. That's what's happening now. Unfortunately, it had to happen at the hands of, George Floyd's death and Ahmaud Arbery's death and so many others. But it's good to see the people rising up, and it's good that so many have galvanized behind our campaign.
And Jamal Bowman, could you talk about your experience as a teacher and a principal in the Bronx, and what made you decide to throw in your hat in this race, which is again one of the Democratic moderate senior officials of the Democratic Party in Congress?
Yeah, so I started teaching in 1999 in the South Bronx. I've spent 17 of my 20 years in education in the Bronx, both as a teacher and a middle school principal. And as we all know, our schools are chronically underfunded and under-resourced, but our communities have been historically neglected through policies like redlining and disinvestment. And we continue to support Wall Street and the wealthy among us. We continue to allow large corporations like Amazon to get away without paying federal taxes. And we continue to support out-of-control spending in our military-industrial complex. All the while, the kids that I serve struggle with mental health supports, lack of mental health supports, struggle with housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of job opportunities, environmental racism, you name it. My kids and families have struggled with it. And I got tired of seeing or not hearing the most vulnerable in our community centered in our political discourse, and our children not at the top of the political agenda. It just became unacceptable to me. And I've done a lot of organizing work for education reform, education justice around trauma-informed schools, fully funding our schools, pushing back against the overuse of standardized testing. And I just felt no sense of urgency around what's happening with our kids every day. And it just became unacceptable.
If you could talk about Jamal Bowman, your demand to defund the police, joining that growing cry throughout the country, that demand, what does it mean to you? What does it mean in New York? And also your response to the police commissioner just holding a news conference and saying he's disbanding the entire 600-person anti-crime unit that is so often known for being in undercover, responsible, I believe, for most of the shootings in New York, police shootings?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent first step. And it's a direct response, as I said before, to the protests and the uprisings happening here in the city and across the country. We need to defund the police because we need to demilitarize our police. We need to stop sending federal military equipment to local police department. And we need to focus on accountability and transparency. We need to end qualified immunity at the federal level where police can violate a person's civil rights with impunity, which we've seen happening time and time again. And we need to reallocate and reinvest those resources in community health and community development. So fully investing in our public schools by hiring more teachers, hiring more nurses in healthcare, investing in job programs and everything that creates the infrastructure for collective and self-actualization and determination in our communities. Unfortunately, we continue to disinvest in our communities and add more police to communities so that they feel occupied. That's unacceptable. It's been going on far too long. It's a manifestation of institutional racism through police brutality. And that's why we call for truth and reconciliation, massive financial investment, and massive focus on mental health, social workers, and public health overall.
And Jamal Bowman, I wanted to ask you about the forces arrayed against you on the side of Eliot Engels from, of course, Hillary Clinton making one of her first endorsements on a congressional race this year for Eliot Engels, as well as a major political action committee that receives a lot of Republican money, and a major lobbying group, pro-Israel lobbying group, all behind Engels on top of the Bronx Democratic, the infamous Bronx Democratic machine.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, that is what it is. That's not what we can control. I think what it shows the public and the country is that we've been running an incredibly strong campaign. We have an amazing team. We have an amazing campaign manager, comms director. I mean, we've been running a strong campaign, and we're just focused on doing our job and connecting as much with the voters throughout the district as possible. We've canvassed the entire district from the very beginning, building strong, authentic relationships from Scarsdale to Rye to Co-op City to Edenwald to Yonkers and everywhere in between. And, we're 6 days away from bringing home this victory. I don't know if you saw the recent polling that came out. It has us 10 points ahead. So we're doing very well, and we have our own supports from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Congresswoman Katie Porter, Senator Sanders, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and the New York Times, as well as local elected officials like Senator Gustavo Rivera, State Senator Alessandra Biaggi, and New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer, as well as many other grassroots organizations.
Well, Jamal Bowman, I want to thank you for being with us. In 10 seconds, can you tell us how is it to campaign on the ground in this area, which has been known as the epicenter of the pandemic, what it means for you? We're talking to you in Yonkers now, where you just did an event.
Absolutely. So it means being safe, so maintaining social distancing, making sure we're wearing masks, but to still be present and engaged and to still be listening to the needs of the people on the ground.
Jamal Bowman, thanks so much for being with us. Former middle school principal, running to represent New York's 16th district, challenging 16-term Congress member, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel. And that does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by an amazing team on the ground. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wells. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe.